In other words, it's an invitation to pay attention to historical context, some sociological factors, and theological traditions. And I don't think there's anything revolutionary here, because Vatican II already affirmed the necessity of paying attention to trends or signs of the times. And if we take this conversation seriously, we're bound to open the understanding and practice of faith to contextual developments and possibilities of renewed understanding. I want to end by repeating the obvious. That is, the remarks I've made here come from an insider who still believes in the value, gift, and grace of ordained ministry in the church in Africa and in the world. But we can do it differently. So speaking openly, honestly, and consistently about it, I believe, is a start. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Orobator. That was wonderful. Obviously, especially from the way that he ended his talk, it invites conversation. These are questions that have been raised. So he's willing to take a couple of questions and comments and see where the conversation might go. So let me see if, and I'll let you guide the conversation.
Thank you very much.
You mentioned that it's great tensions in society. Often we don't reflect on how they reverberate in the church. And I wanted to raise the question of an extraordinary tension in African society, at least as we outsiders think about it. The devastating, widespread AIDS crisis, with the loss of young women and men and children being raised by grandparents, etc. Now, that's not immediately in the church, but to what extent does that tension in society, which shows itself in these terrible statistics and reality of victims, or whatever the word you want to use, of AIDS throughout the continent, how does that reverberate back into the church's self-understanding of its ministry?
Thank you very much. Thank you. There is a piece of good news that just came out yesterday, or 2 days ago, I believe, on the statistics of HIV/AIDS across the world, particularly in Africa. And the good news is that in 16 countries on the continent of Africa, there is a significant reduction in the rate of HIV infection amongst young people. That's good news. Good news because in the context which you talk about, it's really been a devastating pandemic across the continent, no question about that. And especially in the 80s and early 90s, the epicenter has been countries like Uganda, Tanzania, and parts of DRC. And you talk about it as tension. I have written about it as crisis, really, for the Christian community. And it has created definitely challenges, posed challenges to the Christian community in many ways. But I think it's important to recognize that the reaction has been, at the grassroots level, very, very positive. It has created a church that is very attentive to the needs of people in crisis. And that through the ministry of lay women and men, especially religious communities of women. in parts of Eastern Africa, communities of religious women pioneered some very creative and effective responses and initiatives to the devastating crisis of HIV and AIDS through education, awareness, and what they call home-based care. That is one level. At another level, it created a tension for the Christian community on questions of methods and means of prevention. Now, unfortunately, this is the most sensational aspect of the tension. How the Christian community struggles with that question of what means, what methods to adopt to reduce the rate of infection. And this is the story that is most widely told in the media. And I think this is one area where, as Christian community in the church in Africa, we have really not been adept. We have not succeeded in engaging with the tension and engaging with the conversation. Because we have reduced our participation or make our engagement with this issue seem only about one aspect of it, that is the morality or ethics of prevention of HIV/AIDS. That is an unresolved tension. It is an unresolved tension. And it continues to create challenges for the Christian community in Africa. And it exposes what I would sometimes talk about, and I have talked about here, as the inconsistency of our ethical discourse in the church in Africa. At the level of the grassroots, with what I call the grassroots really, we have been very successful as a Christian community, extremely successful in pioneering, in taking initiatives that are quite creative to resolve and to respond to this crisis. And in many instances, the initiatives that were taken by religious communities and laymen and women on the ground have become models for how you deal with such a crisis as HIV and AIDS. But that story, unfortunately, is not told, at least not sufficiently enough. So the tension is still there. And I honestly believe that our inconsistency in approaching this tension would undermine the credibility of our voice as a Christian community. I honestly believe that. But we have a chance as a Christian community if we can listen more to the voices of people who are really at the front line. You know, one thing I find very exciting is that when we ask the question, what does the church think about HIV and AIDS and prevention of HIV and AIDS? Well, the question that people are really asking is, what do the bishops, the leaders, think about it? What are they saying about it? But my position is that what they are saying about it doesn't exhaust or even represent adequately what the Christian community is doing about it. And the Christian community is doing a lot about it through the work, the initiatives of lay women and men. In the context of our conversation here today, I would argue that we need to recognize these initiatives as integral, constituent elements of ministry in the church. That is, as part of the overall function, meaning, and mission of the community called church. Fortunately, it's not happening. There's potential for it happening, but not if we keep insisting that at the level of conversation or ethical discourse, what the leaders have to say is what the church really is doing about this tension.